For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Professor Dirk Kotze from the Department of Political Sciences at Unisa is with me today to provide his analysis on the local government elections. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks very much.
Now, your analysis begins by questioning which elections the 2011 elections should be compared with, the 2006 event or the 2009 event. Why do you say this, and what conclusion did you draw?
Well, I think first of all it is important to understand or to try to measure what has happened since 2009, and that will be useful to determine what has happened during the Zuma administration. If you compare it to the 2006 election, then it is local election with local election, but it stretches over two administrations, that of President Mbeki and that of President Zuma. So I think one of the main questions now is rather what has happened since 2009, to what extent did the local demonstrations and the problems within the ANC had an effect on the ANC, and also what is the growth of the DA. Now, especially we know in 2009 the DA grew a lot, especially in the Western Cape. So if you incorporate that and compare it with the 2009 election, then it means that one can see what happened since 2009. If you compare it with 2006 only, then it is obviously comparing apples with apples, but you cannot make that distinction of what happened since 2009.
Now, the opposition party, as you mentioned, the Democratic Alliance, increased its support substantially. Where do you think this support was drawn from?
Well, it is quite interesting. First of all, it looks as if it grew by about 7%, from 17 to 24%, 23%. Although in 2000's election, they were also at about 20% when they cooperated with the NNP, and then it went down and now it came back again. It looks like the DA's support didn't come so much from the ANC, except obviously from the Western Cape. But if you look at the period since 2009, the 2009 election, most of its support, it seems to have come from Cape actually, in all the provinces except the Northern Cape. And then the other interesting point is that of the voter turnout. In areas where the DA did very well, the voter turnout was substantially higher than the national average. And the DA strategists themselves told me that they worked on that assumption that if they have a higher voter turnout compared to the other provinces with a voter turnout of around about 50%, that in itself will give them additional votes without pulling it from other parties. So I think that is what happened ultimately in this election.
Now, as you say, you mentioned that voter turnout played an important role in this election. Can you elaborate on the reasons for this?
Well, first of all, we know that up to this election, the voter turnout was always very low, between around about 48 to 50%. And that was to some extent the expectation. Now, ultimately, it was 56, almost 57%. First of all, the contribution made by the DA's voters explain it to some extent, but the significance of it is under normal circumstances, the higher the voter turnout, the better it is for the ANC. But in this election, it didn't work like that because of the DA's contribution to the voter turnout. I think the difference, if we look at the tendency over time, there's always a difference of about 5 to 7% between the ANC support at national level versus its support at local level. It's 5 to 7% less. And the only way to explain that is the influence of the voter turnout. So the higher the voter turnout for the ANC, the closer it will come to its national average. So at local level, it actually works against them. And that was the significance for this election again, that the majority of the ANC supporters, it seems to have still maintained the voter turnout level of around about 50 or even less. And that worked against them in this election, in most of the provinces.
Now, finally, you speak about 6 types of voter participation that emerged during the course of the election period. Can you briefly explain this?
Yes, I think first of all, I think it's significant that we need to understand what motivates voters to vote, and why do they vote, why do some not vote, And if there's something like a floating vote, is there movement between political parties? Is there something like a rational choice voter who first assess the different parties, their track records, and then make their choice based on that? I think we've reached the point now where it is possible to differentiate between the different types of voters and what motivates them. The first one, which is not unique, but it was quite significant in this election, are those voters who don't want to participate at all. That's mainly the social movements like the Abahlali movement, the Mandela Park Backyarders, or the Western Cape anti-eviction campaign, those type of groups. And they voted for boycott across the board, irrespective of which party. Then there's the voters who were simply apathetic, and they see local government as not as significant as national and provincial government. Therefore, they participate in elections at national and provincial level, and they see basically the state structure as very centralized. So it makes sense more to vote nationally than to vote locally. So they are part of those that stayed away, part of the 43% who didn't vote. Then there are those who were the protest voters, and those are those who participated in the local demonstrations all over the country in the past. It goes back actually to 2002, but especially since 2009. Plus those who, the internal, those ANC supporters who are internally critical of the ANC, especially as a result of the nomination process. Some of them stayed away, some supported independent candidates. Then there are the typical, the pro-ANC voters, and I would say they voted for the ANC mainly because they see the ANC as giving them access to the economy, to a job, to survival, essentially. It's not so much that the service delivery influenced them in the first instance, but their first priority is first of all to be able to make a living, and they see the ANC as providing the access for them to that. Then there are the voters who are what we can call generally the rational choice voters, and those are voters who don't need a party to have access to the economy or for survival purposes. And they try to choose the best possible government, and especially with respect to service delivery. Now I would say many of the DA voters fits into that category. And then I would say there's still quite a significant group of voters who vote or choose a party based on the identity of the party. You know, they feel the party is either associated with liberation, like the ANC, but also smaller parties like the supporters of the PAC or ZAPU or the UDM. Or they do it because of not material interest, but because of the historical association with those parties. So it's a whole spectrum of voters that we really saw in this election.
Well, we hope to see as large a turnout in the next government elections. Yes,
what we can see, what we can expect actually is in the next national election, provincial and national election in 2014, then it will again be high. You know, the average is between 75 and 85% for all the national and provincial elections, and that is in a sense the contradiction between local elections versus national elections. Is this huge gap in participation by the voters.
Well, thank you very much for your analysis. It was fascinating speaking to you.
Thanks very much.
Donate now and give 15 Rand a month. SMS JOIN to 41486.